The 5th European Literature Festival. This is the final event. This is the closing ceremony that we're beginning. We would like to begin first with writer, poet, essayist, Mr. Natsuki Ikezawa. He's going to talk to us about what is world literature and Europe. What is that relationship? So, Mr. Ikezawa has won the Akutagawa Prize for Still Life. He's produced a number of essays and other works, and he works currently on a series that's being featured in the Asahi newspaper. He's also produced the Ikezawa Natsuki personal edit for world literature as well as Japanese literature. He has a great deal of travel experience around Europe, and he draws upon that experience. Back in 2017, for the first European Literature Festival, he gave a speech talking about world literature back then. Today, he's giving a second speech 5 years on. So, Mr. Ikezawa, Professor Ikezawa, if you'd like to take it away. Thank you very much. Now, because of the COVID-19 situation, I'm having to participate in this format, but when I was there real in person, it was such a fun event, and I really hope that we'll be able to do those events soon. Today, I'm going to be talking about, in world literature, what is Europe? It's a very big title, I know, but in my mind, I think of the world that we have, that concept in itself. I believe that it's actually Herodotus that actually produced that concept in his work, History. Looking at the different civilizations around the world, looking at their sense of cosmography or the sense of their universes. What we see today as the concept of the world, I think, began back with Herodotus. Now, what that means is the world is something that is made up of many countries, regions, and areas, and it's almost like a mosaic that all comes together. And each of those different pieces has language, it has the lives of its people, it has beliefs, it has differences of temperament. And those come together as a unit, and as a whole, there is communication and information going back and forth in that world. So we believe that, and we don't doubt that at all, but I think in the first times, it was Herodotus that really kind of defined this. So Herodotus' histories goes back to the Greek and Persian War. It tells the history of that war, and partway through that war, Herodotus talks about the different geographies, the ethnographies. He covers a great deal of variety. It's almost the technical skill of being a historian. He tells all these really interesting anecdotes, and it's very interesting to read in and of itself, but beyond what is actually written in there, looking at these different regions, all these different places, it's very detailed, it's very specific, and he really describes that in great detail. And I think that in all of these different regions, apparently Herodotus himself did travel very widely. He's a very honest man, and he talks about if he's seen it with his own eyes, he can believe it. Beyond that, he talks about hearsay, things that he can't guarantee, and he refers to that specifically in his work. So the range that Herodotus deals with is really all around the Mediterranean, Persia, but all the way down to the southern parts of Egypt as well. So the known world of his day, all of that, he's written about in great detail. If you think about Homer's The Iliad, in there you see descriptions, geographical names and places, but you can't really tell what those places are like in the Iliad. And if you look at the Odyssey, again, it covers a variety of different islands in the Mediterranean Sea, but the vast majority of those are fantastical islands. They don't really exist. So in terms of something that is real, something that is almost scientifically drawn as the world, I think definitely goes back to Herodotus. That's what I believe. Having said that, talking about this overall mosaic world is something that I think we're less aware of these days. I think now that we've come into recent times, in Europe, you're starting to see more autonomy within the individual nations within Europe, and I think that we've become more aware of that general layout of the world. And I think bit by bit, the thoughts have spread around the world. Around the whole world now, I think we have this concept of the world that I was sharing with you. But I think it's fairly recent that we have that understanding. And I think what really pushed that forward with colonization as well as independence, it's going through those processes that we now have all these many countries around us. Again, I'm going to use the word mosaic, but it's this mosaic that's made up of all these countries, and you have this communication between those mosaic pieces for each language, for people's personalities, beliefs, cultures, customs. There are differences, but there are similarities, or maybe they're similar, but there are differences. I think that's what we see in the world today. But there are places where there isn't just a single language in a particular country, so you mustn't class countries just by language. In the past, the kind of things that bound the world together was, for example, Catholicism. The Catholic belief and Catholicism, I mean, Catholicism with a small c means to encompass everything. So it was all about having their beliefs spread around the world. However, that power has weakened. I don't mean to be rude to the Catholic population, but they're not as powerful as they used to be. So instead, what do we have? The economy. I'd like to say the economy, but in fact, the economy doesn't bring people together. It actually devises ways of dividing peoples. That's the sense that I have. It's treating people as consumers and doesn't go beyond that. Therefore, depending on how wealthy you are, people are divided up and classified. In response to that, what is the ability to bring the world together? I think it's literature. Literature looks at first to be extremely diverse, but the fact that these are literary works, this is this really important commonality across all these different works. You can lay all these works side by side, these many diverse works, but it creates a particular world. By region, by country, by race, by language. There are many categorizations within that, but there's something that kind of goes above and beyond that is overreaching. We're creating literature. We're reading literature. That awareness connects people together. Now, the origins of literature is in many places, in happiness, in misery, from royal palaces down to ruins. Literature can be born from anything. All of these things are encompassed within literature. You can use words freely. Now, obviously, countries might have censorship. Books that should be published may not. We do see those phenomena, but if you're in a free country, a country with freedom, then an author or writer can write what they want, and they're able to then distribute that. And also, through the process of translation, it is possible to actually have this shared with others in other languages, and it is through translation that you can read these literary works. That is something that gives you the definition of world literature today. It is translation. Once something is translated, Some works lose a lot of meaning, and well, that's just the case, but there are some works which, once translated into another language, can still have meaning, and they can come together. That comes together as world literature. So translation is as important as creation, or editing, compiling, creating anthologies. It's as important as those roles. At one point, in certain companies, translation was almost seen as a secondary low-level job, but I don't think so. I believe that translation is reimagining the original work. It's based on the original work, but then reborn into another language. And by being reborn in another language, you gain more readers, and that work increases its influence and spreads further. I don't think we need to be so focused on the differences to the original version. It's about appreciating that something new has been born. It was born in a different language, written in another language, but it's possible to read in another language.
And for this universality of literary work, it can expand in the horizontal direction, but also in the vertical direction. It's able to connect. So I said earlier, talked about Herodotus. And from Herodotus, the concept of the world has started. However, going a little more back, let's look at Homer. Homer's Iliad, the first scene, Apollon from afar to the Greek land, he will be throwing an arrow, spearing an arrow, and with this arrow, then the epidemic starts. So from the warriors of Greeks, they will have an arrow from an unexpected area, and that will kill them. So the only option they have is to be afraid, and there are not just one or two people dying, but so many of the warriors will die with the spread of the epidemic. And when we think of why the boundaries, the land in this area of that they own, it's a very congested place with many people. And actually, congestion is all about civilization. In the past, people were living in a large land with farms and cultivating their lands and eating the harvest in a vast area going around, and everyone was all dispersed and feeding on whatever they could get from the farmland and the land. However, productivity has improved, and for the farmland, they didn't have to develop it themselves, and there were people who were able to get food from not making it themselves, but live in the cities and buy food, get the food. And the cities are congested. There's a lot of people living in a small area, and that will be very fun. Things will change quickly, and high-level civilization will be created. So everyone was wanting that kind of a life. But on the other hand, cities were an area where it was very dense with people, a congested area of many people, and that's a lifestyle. And once an epidemic starts to spread, you won't be able to stop it. It will spread from people to people, and before you know it, it's all over. So epidemics, it has been spread out with civilization. So as long as the civilization continues, we will come back again, repeatedly. And literature has captured this in many works. Daniel Defoe has directly, the Japanese title is Pest, The Pest. That was Plague Years, would be the original title probably, and Kafka. Camus' Pest is also famous, and recently Portuguese Saramago, and there is a very scary novel that is about the epidemics too. So through these literary work, we try to understand the significance or what the epidemics are, and also Decameron. They have he has a novel that is from the other side, the backside of the epidemic. So to avoid epidemic, people will gather at a castle in the outskirts of a city and have discussions. So, and they'll be in the backside of the epidemic, trying to avoid. And Garcias Marquez talks about the pest, but cholera in his works. In other words, to understand the current age, literary works are indispensable. And not just literary works, but culture as a whole is necessary for us to understand the world that we are living in. Without economy, we won't be able to survive. We need food to be able to live on. But unless we have culture, if we don't have the literary works, if we don't have the plays, the theaters, if you don't have the opera, the films, there's no significance in living. And I think in the past 2 years, we've really understood that what it means, how it is meaningless to live without culture. And I was watching this EU literature festival from the side, and I was very much happy to see such this dynamic and active discussions going on. And I found many works that if it was a translation, I'll be very much happy to read. And these many poets and also the writers have made adventures, and they have tried to resist what they don't believe in, but they will be based on tradition and try to move on to make a step forward. So that is the Europe's literature. That's the dynamic nature of Europe's literature, and it has been passed on to each region and to the other regions, and is kind of reflected in the languages and the literary works in other areas. And in an address speech by the Nobel laureate, he said that people are able to prosper in order to continue civilization, and the power to prove that will be literature. And I have a strong expectation going forward for the power of literature, and the expectation I have will be towards, much of it will be toward the European authors and writers. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Mr. Kizawa, Dr. Kizawa. With that, we'd like to go on to the second section of the closing ceremony. We'll switch the main language to English, and there will be a Japanese interpretation channel available for the simultaneous interpretation.
The second part of today's event, we have another special guest joining us online from Madeira, where she's currently spending some time writing. The Finnish author, Mia Kanka. Joining her in this discussion, and our special event, Her Excellency Dr. Patricia Floor, Ambassador of the European Union to Japan, is already on stage. And moderating the session will be Anna Maria Liikanen, Director of the Finnish Institute in Japan. Let's see if Ms. Kakimaki is with us now. Hello? Yeah, oh, there you are. Yes. So, hello.
Thank you so much. Your Excellency, Ambassador Floor, ladies and gentlemen, today it gives me a great pleasure to introduce to you Mia Kankimäki. Hi, Mia.
Hello, hi.
Long time no see.
Yes, indeed. 2 years, I guess.
Yes, quite exactly 2 years. Mia Kankimäki is the author of 2 best-selling books, which combine travelogue, memoir, biography, and women's history. Prior to her authorship, Kankimäki has worked in Finnish publishing genre or industry until 2010, when she left her job to traveled to Japan, and wrote her first book, Things That Make One's Heart Beat Faster. And the rest is, one could say, history. In her second book, The Women I Think About at Night, that was published in 2018, Miss Kankimäki traveled in the footsteps of historical female figures. For example, the Danish author Baroness Karen Blixen and the Japanese artist Yayoi Kusama. Mia Kankimäki has received several awards, and the translation rights have been sold to 17 territories, including USA and China. And also, I have to say, and I want to say that Mia Kankimäki has been mesmerized by the Japanese culture for years. And something that you might not have known is that she's also a qualified ikebana teacher of the Soviet school. Now, and this is, by the way, the book, her book in Finnish, and as you can see, we have been reading this quite many times at the Finnish Institute in Japan. But as I mentioned already, so the Finnish Institute, we have the pleasure to inviting Mia Kankimäki to this very festival, the European Literature Festival in 2019. And after that, something very wonderful happened. That was that the translation rights to her book were sold to a Japanese publisher, and we are really thrilled about that. So this is really a kind of concrete result out of this literature festival. And as I have heard correctly, is that her book has also received a very enthusiastic response from the Japanese audience. Now, Mia, Madeira girl, would you tell more about yourself and your books, and maybe the book you're writing, and so forth?
Oh, the book I'm writing now, maybe I will not say anything about that. I hope I will finish it, but it has to do with Japan, and I have been trying to return to Japan for the last 1.5 years to make some research, so I hope it will be possible again one day. But otherwise, I don't know, I have been working with books all my life. I studied literature and was working in a bookshop and then in a publishing house for 10 years until in 2009 I felt I really needed something new, and I had this idea that I want to find a new and inspiring project for myself. So and also I wanted to find a reason to stay in Japan for a longer time. It had been a big dream of mine. Japanese culture had been a dear hobby of mine for years. So at that point I came up with this idea that I would try to take a sabbatical year from my work and come to Japan, to Kyoto, and try to research and write about Seishonagon. And so this is how the first book then came to be.
Excellent, thank you.
Thank you. First of all, Mia, thank you for sending your book to me. I actually got it in a German translation. It's called Dinge, die das Herz höher schlagen lassen. So I enjoyed reading it, and I want to ask you this question. What links a Japanese woman of the 11th century, Sei Shonagon, with a Finnish writer in the 21st century? What have you in common? Of course, I've read the book, and could it be that some of the problems or stereotypes that actually Sei Shonagon faced that long ago are still with us today?
Well, yes, I think so. In some part, when I first read the Pillow book, or Makoran no Soshi, I was just stunned how modern her writings felt. I think she writes in a way that a contemporary reader like me can totally relate to, and especially her lists are like that. She writes lists of charming things and annoying things and so on, and it's a very modern way of writing. It's almost like she could have been a star of social media today, I think. But also what she writes about her life in court, about her thoughts about everyday events, love affairs and relationships. It's astonishing to see how some feelings and things in a woman's life haven't changed at all. It's you can totally connect to what she writes, and also how she observes and describes things is very timeless, I think. For example, some details like the joy of reading a book or putting on some nice clothes, even if no one is seeing you. It's something that everyone immediately recognizes. So I think it was easy for me to think her as a kind of soulmate or a friend, and I wanted to start having a conversation with her. And of course, I also found like many direct similarities with my life and hers. We were single women about the same age and working as writers. I worked in a company and she worked for the imperial court and things like that. But also I think Sei Shonagon was a kind of pre-feminist of her time. She was very proud of being a court lady and a working woman. Instead of staying home, I think most noble women of the time, they were staying home and they kind of lived behind the screens and were not to be seen. And I think she also considered herself to be at least as talented as men and as capable as men. She stepped into men's area in many ways. So yes, I think she's even now a good example of how to take your space as a woman and how to speak up and how to say what you think.
Okay, thank you for that, Mia Kankimäki. Now, did you learn something new about yourself when writing this particular novel?
I could say so. I think that writing this book actually changed my whole life. After writing it, I never returned to my old job. I never returned to my home. I started as a freelance writer and traveling, and I never thought myself to be doing things like that. I'm a shy person and I'm not very courageous, but apparently a shy person can enjoy also traveling alone and doing these things. And also I never expected I could make a living out of writing, so it was a life-changing experience.
Actually, of course, Ikezawa-san talked about the importance and the issue of translation. And actually, reading your book, I also felt that the Pillow Book and Sei Shonagon was at some stage lost in translation. What I mean, you talk about Virginia Woolf, of course, another great feminist, like Sei in her time, but Virginia Woolf didn't really talk about Sei Shonagon. And you relate the story that there was a very peculiar reason for that, because the person, namely Arthur Waley, who had translated the Pillow Book at the time into English, had left out large parts of her work. So it simply decided that it's not appropriate or it's not interesting. So translation, or getting lost in history, getting lost in, how your book or your writing is passed on, is another very big, issue. And of course also how an author feels about a translation when you don't understand the language. You cannot really check yourself. So bringing it from Finnish into Japanese, also of course, a very important step. So I would be very interested in your feelings about translation, and I know that of course your book has been translated now into quite a number of languages.
I think what happened with Arthur Waley translating Seishonagon's book, he only translated the 1/3 of it. I think that will not happen today. That was a different time then. But indeed, I have been thinking about this for the last 2 years a lot, because my books have been translated to several languages, and most of the languages I cannot read. So of course I just have to trust the translator. I think I have been lucky to have excellent translators. With many of them we have exchanged many emails, and they ask me questions and I answer. And for example, with Hiroko Suenobu-san, who translated the Japanese one, and I have the impression that the translators really devote themselves to the task, and they really try to step in my shoes and try to transport the essence and style and the humor of the book to another language. So I really appreciate their work. But that said, of course, for example, with Seishonagon, classical Japanese is extremely difficult to translate. So you have to accept that the English translation is not exactly the same. And it's the same with my books. I think in one way the translation is the same book, but also at the same time it's a different one, just because the languages are different. But even then it's really essential to have them, and I totally agree in what Professor Ikesawa was saying about the importance of translations. I think they are the only gateway for us to understand cultures, and without them, for example, the Japanese literature would have remained totally closed. So even if it's not exactly the same, I think the essence is still there.
Thank you for that. I am sure that we have a bit tight schedule here today, but one big question, and I would like to have a very short reply to. So, how would you describe yourself as a writer, your writing process?
It's not an easy question.
Yes, that's what I said. A very large question, but a very short reply. Thank you.
Well, I think I'm chaotic as a writer, but I think why I write, it's mainly because I want to learn about things. So I think writing is all about learning and doing research and learning and understanding new things. And my point as a writer is to write about what I've learned and then try to write it in a way that maybe a reader can feel inspired too.
Thank you so much. Now, Ambassador Flora and myself, we have here tons of questions for you, but unfortunately time is running. So I would like to thank at this time you, Mia Kankimäki, on the very nice weather on Madeira and for taking all the time and coming to this closing event. And I have read your both books, as you know. I'm a great, huge fan. And so I would like to end this session by concluding something that you already know, but I'm sure that maybe some of the audience, this may become as a novelty. This is a citation from the Virginia Woolf, I quote, and this has to do with you, Mia. Therefore, I would like you to write all kinds of books, hesitating at no subject, however trivial or however vast. By hook or by crook, I hope that you will possess yourselves of money enough to travel and to idle, to complain the future or the past of the world, to dream over books and loiter at street corners and let the line of thought dip deep into the stream. End of quote. And I would like to say that Mia Kankimäki, you are precisely doing exactly what the Virginia Woolf urged all the writers to do, to contemplate the future or the past of the world. So in your books, you're navigating very smoothly from the 11th century to today, and you're intertwining your own story to the powerful female role models of the past and present. And by doing that, Mia Kankimäki, I would like to say that you have become a role model yourself.
Thank you so much, Anna-Maria.
You're welcome.
Well, that brings us to my final closing words. And I would like to thank Professor Ikezawa for joining us. And let me again link with what he said, that actually literature is the link between different worlds, or between different cultures, between different languages. It can be this link. And I must say that I've always felt that literature actually it's a discovery. It enriches us, it inspires us, and also it allows us to see ourselves mirrored in others, in the figures in the book, but also in the writers. So I want to say a big thank you to both you, Mia Kankimäki, and to Professor Ikezawa for joining us today. But I also want to thank all of the cultural institutes in the European Union member states and their efforts to bring this literature festival again into being this year, again in a hybrid way under Corona conditions. I would like to thank also all of our Japanese partners, and thank you for joining us today. So to all the friends of literature and of the EU and European Literature Festival, thank you very much. And join us again next year. Thank you.
We conclude the official part of this ceremony, and thereby also conclude the 5th European Literature Festival. Thank you.
But of course, there's a final word, which is that for those of you, who have joined us here in person, and it's really a great pleasure because this is the first time at the end of this year of state of emergencies and restrictions, that we are actually able to invite you to a small reception